everyone, and welcome to Fueling Collaboration panel discussion series. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Andrea Brandon, and I'm a science delivery specialist with the Northern Research Station, and it's my absolute privilege to be hosting today's discussion. So before we get started, we do have a quick poll set up. Eric, would you please launch our poll? All right, so we just have 3 questions that we hope everybody will answer, just giving us a bit of a sense as to who's with us today. So the question 1, what best describes your work? Question 2, where are you physically located? And then question 3, how did you hear about today's webinar? So we're just going to keep this poll open for about another 15 seconds or so to give folks an opportunity to respond. And we've got a big group with us today. It's wonderful to see so many people here. So we're at about 70% response rate. So why don't we close this poll in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and sharing those results. Looks like we've got a good mix of folks with us today. So thank you again so much for responding to that poll. So Fueling Collaboration panel discussion series is presented by the Joint Fire Science Program, Fire Science Exchange Networks in the Eastern United States, as well as the Forest Service Northern Research Station and Southern Research Station. And this is our 4th season offering this Fueling Collaboration discussion. So if you've joined us in previous years, welcome back. And if this is your first time participating, we really hope that you will like the structure and the style of this panel discussion series that we've curated today. So the goals of Fueling Collaboration are to bring together researchers and managers together to learn about and to discuss the latest in fire science and application, and to build collective learning and collaborative opportunities across the region. So this is the first of a 4-part discussion series. And in prior years, we've talked about things including fire history and its use in present day management, excuse me, opening up the burn window, prescribed fire in the WUI as some examples. And all of our discussions follow a similar format to what you're going to see today. So group discussion, minimal PowerPoint presentation slides, and the discussion built on questions that you've submitted in advance. So thanks to everyone who has submitted questions. And I apologize, I am getting over strep throat, and clearly I've got a tickle in my throat now. So before we get into today's discussion, I have just a couple logistical points to go over. So firstly, today's webinar is recorded, and we will be posting the recording on both the Northern Research Station as well as the Fueling Collaboration websites. Closed captioning is available. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see where it says CC. You can just click on that for live captioning. And this discussion is approved for 1.5 Category 1 CFEs by the Society of American Foresters. And we will be using the participant list to submit to SAF. So if your name is not correct in the participant list, I encourage you to find your name, go to it, and you'll see 3 little dots next to your name. Click on those dots and select rename. And there you can enter in your correct first and last name. So final point is all participants will be muted throughout this discussion, but the chat box is open, and we do encourage active participation in that chat box. But please, we ask you to keep it on point and to please be respectful. So today's discussion is focused on fire history as a bridge between ecological knowledge systems. And our panelists include Indigenous knowledge holders and practitioners, experts in tree ring, sedimentary, and archeological fire history, who collectively use fire history information to bridge cultural and knowledge systems. And the discussion is going to focus on 2 case studies in the Upper Great Lakes region. Our moderator today is Dr. Evan Larson, and Evan is the professor and chair in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Society at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. And I just want to say thank you so much, Evan, for your willingness to moderate today's discussion. So Evan will provide some opening remarks and then introduce our panelists. But before I pass it to him, just a couple quick other items I'd like to touch on. One, I want to say thank you so much and acknowledge all of the organizers who have participated in this Fueling Collaboration panel discussion series. The folks and names that you see here have contributed their expertise into making this series a success. I also want to welcome you to participate in the remaining 3 discussions of this season. So in December, we're going to talk about the future is smoky. January, the phenology of fire, listening to the plants and animals. And in February, successfully bridging the gap, Eastern US models of fire science and management collaboration. So at that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Evan. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much, Andrea. It's really exciting to be here. 327 I see as far as participants, which is that's fantastic. I'm really excited to see where everybody's from, where your backgrounds, and what brings you here to this conversation. And so this opening part, I'm going to be talking to you, the registrants and the attendees, and then what we're going to do is we're going to shift into what I hope is very much a conversation where the panelists are addressing each other, and we can get into some of these conversations. And I've had, the real distinctive pleasure to work with most of the panelists directly, and I'm aware of the work of the others. We've got an incredible group of people who very generously offered up their time. So I'm really excited to see where it goes. The background for this conversation that I'll share is it's rooted in my own experience, to give you a sense of kind of where I'm coming from and why I'm so excited to be in the mix of this incredible group of people. And so I grew up in central Minnesota, Malacca. My parents, they tended about 80 acres. It was like 15 miles outside of this tiny town. I grew up, we would burn our meadows and prairies. That was always part of what we did. We heated with firewood. So fire as a process has always been part of my life. We also had a wood shop, so woodworking. It was when I went to college that I was first introduced to the science of dendrochronology. That was through a tree ring based fire history project on the dry side of the Cascades. And ironically, for the conversation we're having today, part of that work was looking for places that didn't have human influences, so we could look at natural processes and how they shape forest communities. And so my academic introduction to fire and fire science came at that time, and it's been really interesting to both look at the past and also to live an evolving narrative that we have around fire as a society. And so a lot of the early papers I read about were kind of starting at that point of this concept of total fire suppression. And at that time, there were a lot of great illustrations of like, oh, look, Smokey Bear, fire suppression, and now we have dense forests. And so linking that management with changing forest conditions that then was linked to fire behavior. And then kind of within my early career, increasingly talking about climate change and climate-driven droughts, increasing fire severity and frequency, and size, and that was a really important driver too. And I think it's very interesting if you look at kind of the big scale, because it was just a handful of years in my own awareness, all of a sudden, where I started seeing the newspaper articles and the little pieces in like Nature Conservancy and things like that, talking about like, hey, yeah, so those things are real, but like there's also this thing, maybe you call it Indigenous fire stewardship, but this is another component of the fire system that is also directly related to kind of where we're at right now. And so it feels like this emergence of awareness has really expanded kind of at the societal scale. Then you layer on the pandemic and how issues of justice, social and environmental, have really come out. And now we increasingly recognize in both our lives and our work how social justice is a component of everything that we do. And then you look at the way forward. And so it was in the middle of all this where the tree ring fire history work I was doing up in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness very clearly underscored that that wilderness never existed in the way that we think of it. And so here we are as a society, we're looking at a very uncertain future. We know fire is going to be a part of it. And we're trying to figure out collectively, how do we move forward in a good way? And so part of that means that we now have to think about how are we going to engage in what can be extremely difficult conversations, because we're not just talking about fire. We're talking about historical trauma. We're talking about justice. We're talking about practices that are linked with essentially structural genocide that now we have to wrap into conversations about how do we live with fire, and then how do we share this space moving forward. And so this is a hard conversation. And I know a lot of people either are starting it or want to, but maybe don't know how. And when I look at this panel, I think that there's not a better group that I know of that can talk about right here in the Great Lakes region, where fire historically has not been as much of a conversation, other than, the Hinkley fire, the Peshtigo fire, some of these big catastrophic events. So now we're looking at this place where it's like, we have to start talking about fire and this history in the context of figuring out a way forward. And so within all of these conversations, what I think I have found, and I think that the panelists will agree, is that those paleo data, the tree ring records and the charcoal records that help tell kind of the what of fire, like when were fires burning, how often were they burning, that can provide a really powerful bridge, a really effective bridge to then starting to talk about the why did fires burn and bringing in that human story. And so with that as a background to kind of this conversation that we're going to go forward with, we're going to start off just by having each of the panelists introduce themselves. Their bios are available online, so if you want those details, go there. The important thing that we're going to do here in conversation with Joe Marshall, as we were talking about this panel, he said it's important that you know that this series of panel discussions is not necessarily a pro or an anti-fire conversation, right? It's not arguing that we should have more fire on the ground, because the Fire Science Consortia are about sharing knowledge and helping kind of lead those conversations that then translate into your practice. I will say that I do not think that that is the same perspective shared by the panelists, and that we all carry biases about our perspectives on if we should have more fire on the ground. And so what I'll do is I'm going to see Kurt on the top left. I'm going to ask you to start, and I'd like you to introduce yourself in like a sentence or so, and then share your bias about perspectives on if we should have more fire on the ground.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for inviting me to participate on the panel. My name is Kurt Kiffmeller. I am a professor of geography at the University of Minnesota. I grew up in Michigan. I've been doing fire history work using tree rings since 1995 in a variety of landscapes. For the last decade or so, I've been working primarily in the Upper Great Lakes, developing fire histories in a variety of landscapes. I've more recently started to work with a lot of the people on this panel to try to better understand cultural fire. And I'll just state my bias is that we need more fire on the ground in the Upper Great Lakes. And I'll leave it at that.
Kurt, can you call on somebody, since I don't know what your screen shows?
Damon, you're to my left.
Hey, bonjour, everybody. Damon Ponick, Indigenous Knowledge, Kawababi Ganaka, Gishkan and Gining and Dunjaba, Minawa Masquabikang and Da, Minawa Nakajiwanang and the Nuki, Wildland Fire Program Manager, Chmokamanaj Naka Demagak, Minawa Yate Ishkodwade. So one that extinguishes fire, Gainaway Nishkodade, Minawa, someone who tends to a fire, Minawa Nayadama Wishkodade, which is someone who is like an ally to fire. Happy to be here. Working for Fond du Lac as the Wildland Fire Program Manager. Before that, spent 21 years at the National Park Service, Apostle Islands National Lakeshore as a park ranger, fire management coordinator, and was involved with Evan and Kurt and Gregor and all these other people to get fire back on the ground out on Stockton Island after 80 years of exclusion. So yes, cultural fire, we need more of it on the ground. We need more collaborative relationships to help that happen, to empower our tribes to and our people to maintain their identity through fire and that relationship to the landscape. So yep, I'm all for it. Let's see, Gregor, I'll pick on you.
Yeah, thank you, Damon. My name is Gregor Skierman. I'm an ecologist with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program. I've worked with the program for about 10 years. And, you know, in that first poll, I kind of had trouble. Am I a researcher or a manager? I kind of sit right in between, trying to help parks and partners understand and adapt to climate change. In terms of thinking about fire, my bias, if I could call it that, is to get fire right. My deeper history as a scientist is in Africa, where fire often burns unattended. There's a high degree of comfort with it. I've also worked in Hawaii, where fire really isn't part of the system. And as we've seen in Lahaina and now on Oahu, when it does burn, you get some catastrophic results. So, you know, I think about a lot of different landscapes, although I did spend a half dozen years working for Wisconsin DNR, so I have a connection to the upper Midwest. But when I think more broadly, what it contextualizes for me is in each place, the equation might be different, and it's about getting it right. And a lot of that is about understanding where we come from, both culturally and in terms of what sediments and trees can tell us about deeper histories. And I will choose Dan.
Anin, Bagwajanini, Indigenous Knowledge, Tiacha, Bonning, and Dunaki, Wabajation, and Dudem. My name is Dan. The English name is Dan DeVault. I'm from Leech Lake. I currently work at Leech Lake Tribal College. I'm also getting a master's in biology involving fire on plant communities. I co-teach, right now I co-teach some classes at Leech Lake Tribal College and add fire stuff. I also do a summer internship program with students, and that's where I've met a lot of people here. It's really neat. I really enjoy talking about fire, the uses of it. I grew up with my grandmother, who was a fluent first speaker of Ojibwe, and she would talk about how it affects the forest, and the fire was actually good for it. So, which Mio, that's about all I got to say.
At risk of silence, I'll just say, Dan, would it be okay if Beth went?
Yep, that's.
Good morning. My name is Beth Lynch, and I am a paleoecologist. I use charcoal and pollen buried in lake sediments to try and reconstruct how fire and vegetation and climate have interacted over very long periods of time, thousands of years. And in terms of my bias, I'm with Gregor. I see a lot of, I don't want more fire or less fire. I want the right fire in the right place. I came into this whole, my interest in fire came from watching in northwestern Wisconsin management of pine barrens using fire without any cultural or ecological context, just kind of burning for the heck of it because it seemed like the good thing to do. And I was motivated by that seeing that on the landscape to try and figure out, okay, well, what is the fire regime for this place? And can we learn more about that and be smarter about our application of fire so that it preserves the things that we are interested in preserving, whether they're cultural or ecological or both. And with that, I go to Sean and Marcy.
Buju Ani Wingash Indigenous Knowledge. Kasaga Squadramikuk Makwa Indundem. Welcome, everybody. I've been part of the Fire History Project here on the forest since its initiation. I believe fire really needs to return to the landscape. Ishkodi, fire, it's a spirit. It wants to be heard. It wants to bring back life to the land. Thank you.
I'm Sean Dunham. I'm the Heritage Program Manager in the Chippewa National Forest. And like Marcy, I've been involved with the fire history work we're doing here on the forest with Kurt and some other folks here on the and Dan. I'm an archaeologist. I started noticing patterns, doing archaeological research throughout the Upper Great Lakes and contract work and things like that over the years, where there was an association between many indigenous sites and fire dependent landscapes. And there does seem to be some relationship in the deep past that are becoming more clarified by my role involved with this project here. Like some of the people who have spoken, I'm not necessarily pro or against fire. I'd like to see the right fire because I think fire is appropriate in certain landscapes more than in others. But fire has a role in all landscapes. So as Marcy said, it's a spirit that wants to be heard. So I think there's different ways to view it. Thanks.
Thanks for sharing that, everybody. To give just a little more context, I realized we didn't talk about this, just there are some resources that were distributed that talk about kind of the projects that are serving as the case studies. And so Gregor and Damon and Beth are associated with a publication that just came out where it was a sediment record of a charcoal-based fire history for Stockton Island, which is in the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, and really at the heart of Anishinaabe country in that space, a really important place. Kurt and Marcy and Sean and Dan. Well, Kurt, you actually also did tree work out on Stockton Island, so you're part of that group too. And you're the bridge over then to Leech Lake, where there's a great story map that was shared that talks about a really beautiful collaboration that has emerged there, using tree rings to get that quantitative record, and then using that indigenous knowledge and the oral history on those places to really provide that deeper understanding. And so you have all been involved in a project that engaged in multiple ways of knowing, multiple knowledge systems to come to a more complete understanding. At the same time, like, we're constantly thinking about how do you privilege or empower certain knowledge systems over the other? Do you do it intentionally? Do you do it unintentionally? And so to start this conversation, to just kind of talk about like, how do we value and how do you perceive these ways of knowing and systems? I'm wondering if Marcy and Damon and Dan, if you are thinking from an indigenous perspective of like having these stories that tell you the truth, and then you get these Western scientists coming over and they're like, I'm going to tell you the truth with my tree rings and my charcoal. I would love for you to just kind of share your perspective on what, because you said yes to the collaborations, like what value do you see in these records that you've now worked with?
I can start if that's okay. I feel like a lot of the work that we're doing, the essence of the work is helping each other and filling in gaps. Like if Kurt has a gap, maybe I can fill that in with a story that an elder told me about staying somewhere or something like that, or maybe an elder remembers a certain part of something that literally Kurt can find that fire in a tree ring. We've had instances of that where an elder would talk about being out with his family in a certain time period, and then we have the tree ring data to back up those stories. So it seems like they complement each other. And what I think is really cool about that is that it brings in a whole other layer that can add a little bit more juicy flavor to the kind of the data, right? And really provide an opportunity for all of us to connect as human beings living in this world together, right? And I just love that way that it provides what people need from all of their different perspectives. And so if you're data driven, there you go. You can go to Beth's work, you can go to Kurt's work, to Evan's work, Gregor's work, you can get all that. If you're cultural driven, then you come in, you can talk to us and we'll fill that in for you. So I think the combination of the two has been so powerful, and seeing more of it happen and seeing these like epiphanies of understanding that just when Evan and Kurt and I, we sit down and talk and we're just like, whoa, this is what was going on, or, things like that. It just is so mind blowing. And it's unfortunate that it takes this much effort for us to like get the people in positions of power to listen. But if that's the world we live in right now, then okay, we'll do that. But I would also say that we should only have to do that for a certain amount of time. And then let's move forward and keep going, because like, our culture is dependent on these systems and the species that are a part of them. So like, we can't be an Anishinaabe unless we have these places. So let's move on. Let's move on past the talking and get into action. That's all I got to say.
Anne or Marcy, do you have more to like add on to that?
I think the collaboration I've had with I've worked a lot with Kurt Kimpfmiller and Sean, is that it complements each other. Both the history, both the timeline, both the timelines get to exist next to each other, and there's no my personal happenings was always accepted as just knowledge, and I was never told it was wrong or incorrect. And even Kurt had an epiphany. We were riding back on a boat, and it was like, yeah, and I explained something of moving cycles, and he went, this makes total sense. 20 years ago I would have said, oh well, there's 10 fires happening every year at this exact time, and I'm like, no, they were moving there. And he's like, I know. And it was such an awesome experience, and I think that's what needs to happen. I grew up with Smokey the Bear. I'm terrified of Smokey the Bear, not as an adult, but as a kid, it was like a scary concept that he was this guy was putting out fires and all this kind of scary stuff, and he's kind of scary looking when you're a kid. But I'm so happy to see future with fire used in a culturally sensitive way or culturally relevant. That's the key points, is when to burn and when it should happen, what the intervals it should happen. I was on a fire, the first one at where I collect my data for is Sunken Lake, and I was at that fire and the ground was still frozen, and these firefighters, I'm trained as a firefighter too, I just don't get to go out because I have little kids. But I went out there, and it was so awesome because they were saying this is a perfect fire, and I'm like, yeah, it is, huh? And they were just accepting of that too. So that's my add to that.
So my add to that is, growing up, my grandparents raised me, and you would have these people go start fires within the reservation. And, some say these fires were started by, just regular people, so people could get on the ground to get some work done. So, my grandma would say, good, that's gonna turn green. So right there, it told me that, those fires are supposed to be on that ground. Robin Kilmer talks about in her book, the animate beings within the landscape. Those trees are still there, telling the story. The Western science wants this on paper. We as Indigenous people have this knowledge integrated within us. Thank you.
So then on the flip side, Kurt, Beth, Gregor, and Sean, right? So you're coming in with the data and you're working with partners who I would say it could be a legitimate, like, you don't need to tell me this, I already know, right? And so how do you feel that working in this context, working with blending these ways of knowing, how does that affect you as a scientist, as a researcher, from your perspective?
I think, we're all in a similar boat, but my background, is largely coming out of anthropology, so this idea of attempting to integrate ideas that are outside Western science is there, though historically that wasn't always the case. And I think that my own journey, like I mentioned when I introduced myself, is I was seeing patterns in the woods while I was doing archaeological surveys and while I was doing archaeological investigations, which got me to think about different things. And then so looking at different sources, whether it was ethnographic sources from across the border in Canada and Ontario, or coming from ecological studies of tree rings or things like that. And it all started coming together. And I think, Dan was just saying something like, it's all knowledge. So whether we want to think about it as Western knowledge or traditional knowledge, all this is based on observation of data of some sort. And the difference sometimes is simply the way it's presented, the place where it's stored, like Marcy said, it's imbued in her experience, and my coming to the table on this is tied into my experience, seeing things in the landscape, and then curiosity and trying to figure out how does this place that in many ways looks the same as this place, why is it different? Why is there an archaeological site here? And so that process is kind of what drove me into this. So I see it all as knowledge, and it may be put together differently, but it's all going to lead us to a particular understanding.
I could talk a little bit about the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore work in conjunction with Damon. I guess I'll just have to tell it in a bit of a story, but I'll try not to be too lengthy in it. But as we say in the paper, in 2016, the park had a question. And the question was essentially, we've got these globally imperiled Great Lakes barrens acres. We seem to be seeing some encroachment over time. And so the concern was about what is generally called a natural community, right? And I think it was just a good process in terms of the park pulling people together. It may have involved a few people just kind of nosing their way in. But in the end, we had a good group there. And within that group was Damon's partner in cultural preservation, Melanie Montano, who, and this is kind of where things just came in sideways. I was there as a climate change guy, just being asked to think, okay, we've got a problem today, or we think we do. Where are we headed climatically in the future, and how might that change the picture? So my angle was supposed to be sort of the forward-looking part of it. But Melanie basically just did what an Indigenous person from the land can do, and just kind of talked about fire and creation stories and blueberries and barrens and the 20th century history, and all of this just wrapped up in a monologue that for me, it was like, okay, that's a whole new thing I'm seeing. Not that I've never heard of this kind of thing before, but the richness, the authenticity was just completely compelling. And so, but also very dissonant in this meeting, because our park managers, every park likes to say it's unusual in some way, and every park is. And so the argument here is, no, you don't understand, these are islands. So it's a heavily fire-broken landscape. So we are not convinced that fire was ever here other than people putting it on here. And so they didn't know how to think about this. And so there just seemed to be some low-hanging fruit. I went to the University of Minnesota for my master's degree. Beth Lynch was sort of a late stage grad when I was a first year, little baby grad student. And I never did paleoecology, but I was around it there in the 90s as a lot of stuff was happening. And so I just saw it as a tool in a toolbox. And so up pops this question, you know, like, what's the fire history of this place? What do we know beyond oral histories? What other lines of evidence can we bring to bear? And that was just it. It was just an open question with a compelling cultural dimension. And then I think we just kind of assembled the right experts, Beth and Bob. We had Damon as an advisor to the project, which was fantastic. And I'll just sort of finish up with this, with this nugget as this sort of epiphany. We're focused on Stockton Island. We're focused on the Tombolo in particular, this sandy area between what had been originally two separate islands. It's about a 6,000-year-old landscape. And we're trying to puzzle through the science stuff. We're bringing this evidence that's compelling. And at a certain point, though, we're trying to write the paper. And there's some decisions we could make about to what degree do we translate what we're doing into the Ojibwe language? To what degree do we, in our map, use the Ojibwe name first, for instance, and the English name second? Just lots of choices, lots of opportunities, sort of a wide open landscape to try to do the right thing, but also this kind of fool's rush in, caution in the back of your mind, right? Use your emotional intelligence. And to get to the nugget, as we're trying to write this, and okay, so what is the name of Stockton Island in the Ojibwe language? And oh, hey, that name actually refers to the behavior of fire on the land in that place. So the name itself, the Ojibwe name itself, is about fire on that place. And, you know, Damon, feel free to jump in and kind of add on to that. But I just saw these threads connecting. It wasn't about manufacturing it. It was just about being curious, being aware, and respectful, and all these good things. And stuff just kind of bubbled up that blew my mind.
So this is where it can just evolve into a conversation. We don't have to have everybody speaking. I'm sure you will all get a chance to share. Damon, you want to go? Beth, you want to talk about your own transformations, if there were any?
I'd be happy to add a little bit. I guess I have to say that from way back when, my interest in fire and landscapes and things has been about more than just, I've always been interested in the role that people have had in that, you know, and so I have the tools as a paleoecologist to reconstruct what happened. You know, I can, to a certain degree, say there was fire here and this was this kind of fire and it changed over time. But it's been frustrating for me as a scientist not to be able to know more about, well, why was there fire and why did it change and who was there? I know this wasn't all lightning fire. So there are many, many questions that I can't answer as a paleoecologist, and to be able to participate in the project at Stockton Island, where there were people with the interest in, you know, communicating about just talking about the cultural use of fire on that landscape, and then combining that with the data that we had, was for me a really rich experience, and one that I have not had in other projects. And I'm very thankful to Gregor for inviting me to be part of that, and for Damon and Melanie for their willingness to just share so much. That's not something that you get on every project. And so I'm just very grateful to that. I learned a lot. It was, to me, that's the best work that I can do. If my data are helpful, then, you know, that makes me happy. Helpful beyond just understanding what happened, but who, why.
I'll add a couple of things because it relates to Stockton, but it also connects back to Leech Lake too. And I'm like Evan. I started off doing fire history in an area that I worked always in wilderness areas because I was trying to remove the influence of people. At that point, though, it was more or less trying to remove the influence of more recent colonists, not necessarily indigenous, trying to get an idea. And partly this has to do with when I started. When I started working on this, climate change was just kind of coming into its own. And so our interests primarily were trying to understand the relationships between fire and climate. So we needed to get a history of fire because we had no history in the last 100 years. So I was biased from a very early sort of standpoint of trying to understand the physical dynamics that control fire. And it wasn't until much later that I started to think about how people have influenced that. And I remember my first trip up to Stockton Island, I was already skeptical before I even started, only because everything I knew about Stockton Island from people that I talked to said, all of the trees out there are young, they were all harvested, there's no stumps around, there's no fire history that can be had. So I was pretty skeptical going out there. We met Damon at the dock for the first time, had some great conversations, and then walked around looking for fire-scarred stumps. And Damon, if you remember the first day we were out there, it was a bit of a challenge. We probably cut 50 stumps. We probably cut 100 stumps in total just to see if there were scars in them, because all of them were charred. There had been a fire in the 1920s that pretty much reinitiated the forest, and it really did do some, from a fire historian standpoint, it kind of did some damage to the record because it burned a lot of it back. So the record became really, really spotty. But if I had looked at that in a different way, like had I looked at it from from a Western science perspective only, I would have gotten a list of events and I would have compared it back to the climate record to try to figure out if there was a climatic influence there. But that wasn't necessarily the intent. And so we were trying to figure out where places burn, when places burn, how often, how frequent. But I remember having conversations with Damon very early on, because I went out there with what I had been told, that Stockton Island was a very, very important place for blueberry harvest. And it had been burned to promote blueberry production, which kind of went along with what I knew human use of fire in the Upper Great Lakes was for. What I came away from that experience with was that that's Stockton Island. And Stockton Island was burned probably to enhance blueberries. However, there are a whole lot of other uses of fire. So it sort of opened my mind to thinking much, much more broadly about fire. And I can remember a really distinct conversation with Damon when I think I asked, like, well, you know, there's not a lot of information in the oral history. There's not a lot of information in the historic record regarding fire and indigenous use of fire in the Upper Great Lakes. We have a few things here and there. Why is that? And Damon's response was, burning was such an important part of our life, we wouldn't really have had to think about having an oral tradition to pass it on or write it down. Just, it's one of those things that happens so frequently that it really was sort of I'm going to put words in your mouth, Damon, you can correct me, but it kind of like an afterthought. It's like, we just burn. And I think that opened up my eyes for when we went to work at Leech Lake. And ironically, I don't know if you can hear this, there's a chainsaw going on in the background here. When we went to work at Leech Lake and on Star Island is a very different landscape. It had a well-established village, and Sean and Marcy and Dan can correct me on my history here, but we expected to see different patterns, or we thought we might see different patterns. And Dan mentioned this when we were coming back from one of the trips. One of the things that you see at Star Island that I think is kind of cool is that between like 1790 and 1813, you have like 7 fires. They're really, really close in spacing in terms of the interval, really unusually close in a lot of respects. And we were talking, it was just and this is what I love about these collaborations. I'm just going to say this. The casual conversations that we have always open up my mind to something I had not ever expected. And so we just happened to be talking about this, and Marcy and Sean and Dan were usually out at the same time. And we were trying to figure out, why would you burn that much? And we kind of came around to the idea that, well, if you're going to live on that landscape and you first enter into that landscape, you have to do some preparation to make the landscape a more livable place. And it probably requires repeated fires to wipe the brush out so that you have an open forest so you can see people coming, which is something I learned that's important. That having an open forest feels like having an open heart, something else I think we discussed. And so I could see all of these different uses for fire that I hadn't really thought about, but it started to make sense. So like Beth and like Gregor, as a paleoecologist, I can identify events, but I can't really identify intent. But having the conversations that we have help us to understand the intent and help us to understand the why of the process. And I'm a geographer. I've always been interested in how people influence the environment, how the environment influences people. And to me, like, this is like a really, really place-based sort of work, because every single landscape we go into has a different story. And you can capture that story using what the tree rings want to tell us, what they want to share, but it still requires some level of interpretation. And that's something that I'm still really struggling with. And I'm trying to make sure that I'm not just looking at fire history. I'm trying to break old habits, really. I'm trying to think about these things in a little bit different way. So I have a long origin story with respect to that. And Evan knows very well, there have been some really painful moments for me where I had to transition from, like, well, that's the p-value doesn't work out or whatever. And I have this really weird spectrum. Like, some days I'm really into, like, let's figure out what the statistical relationship is between this. And other days I'm sort of like, we don't need to do any more fire history because we know it all. But we don't, because there are a lot of places that we just still don't have that understanding about. I can go on for a long time, so I'll stop.
Okay, so gosh, like, I kind of want to let you just run, but there's a couple things that came out in this that I would love for you all to explore, because I'm going to go off of you, Kurt, because I'm hearing you talk about essentially like this transformative experience, right? You're seeing the landscape in a different way, and you're understanding your data and your work differently, and I think in a richer way. And Beth, Gregor, you're also kind of having that experience. And so thinking about some of the questions that folks have asked when they were registering, like, I hear the benefits that you're getting, right? You're able to tell a story, the paper publications, like, they're more compelling. From that perspective, like, I hear what you're getting out of this. Marcy, Dan, Damon. Well, Damon, I know you were driving this boat. Like, like, you were going to see this conversation happen, and you and I have talked about this. And so I want to look at Marcy and Dan, and I want to know when you got an email from this guy, Kurt Kickmuller, University of Minnesota. Hey, I want to do some fire history. Like, why'd you say yes?
Can I tail in really quickly? That's often not the way it happens, right? That's not the way it happens. So you guys can answer, but I may tag that.
Yeah.
Do you want me to just go out? I can go say more. Often the way it works is that.
Kurt, I'm cutting you off. Marcy's got her hand up.
Okay.
So back in, let's see, 2019, me and Sean, I just started here on the forest. And he says, do you want to go check out the research center? They're doing some tree ring data over there. And I'm like, okay, sure. So we get in the car, we drive over there. Here I meet Kurt, Evan, the most enthusiastic men I've seen in my life about fire. I'm like, wow, Sean, this is crazy. I've never seen someone so enthused about their research. Their enthusiasm, like, just pulled me in. Like, I love this. I want to learn with them. And ever since then, it's never stopped. I love learning with them. Thank you.
One thing that I think that's really important to remind everybody about is that we're all human beings and that we all have a cultural presence on this landscape, and that we relate to each other through that cultural understanding. And I know Kurt and Evan and Beth and Gregor, their heart is in this as well. And it's not just their data and not just their minds, but we are all cultural beings trying to find our way. in this space, right? And I think that blending the two, I mean, I love data too. I'm like, this is great how we can back each other up. Like Kurt's got my back on his data and I've got his back on our cultural understanding of these places. So it just adds a layer that I know y'all try and pretend like you're not cultural beings, but you really are. And we all are. All across this whole world, we're cultural beings with a relationship to our landscapes. And like, so I think that this like quest to like learn more and understand more isn't just an Anishinaabe thing. This is about everybody trying to be aware in our spaces of where we are. So I just want to put that out there that, you know, it isn't culture and data, it's both together, blended and moving forward, you know.
That's a force.
Oh,
I was gonna say, I've always had a interest in fire from my grandmother, who talked about, I can remember picking Bagasanak, all kinds of nuts, actually hazelnuts, and with my grandmother, and it was after fire, and then we would pick. We notice they would shoot up and just be a whole bunch of nuts to pick, and that's what we would eat over the winter. And she said that's what her grandmother taught her. And then I went to I went to fire school in 2004, but then I joined the Army and I never quite got back into it. Then I just kept up my trainings, and then I started this job in 2019. And it was funny because I stopped my master's I initially started, which was going to be on fire. And I ended up running into, they said, do you want to go look at this thing on Star Island? And I was kind of hesitant because as a kid, they're like, don't go to Star Island. It's got XYZ stuff. And I'm like, well, I'll just put tobacco out. I think I'll be okay. Because they would tell us not to go there. And but I met Kurt, and I also met Sean, and I met Marcy. I've known Marcy for quite a while. But it was the enthusiasm and the knowledge, the open knowledge sharing. It was so awesome. And it was kind of neat because I ran into Sean, and he said, you could turn that into a master's degree. And it was so awesome to having it was very much collaboration, and it felt very, very fluid, and it's just really awesome. So I'm done.
Beth, you were gonna say something. Kurt, you want to say something? I'll let you two figure it out.
Go ahead, Beth.
thanks, Kurt. I think yeah, it's great to hear everybody. And I think the enthusiasm, you know, that I'm hearing that the enthusiasm that Evan and Kurt brought when they approached you was really important. And I think something that we non-Indigenous scientists sometimes struggle with is, how do we gain trust? You know, it's a lot to ask of people to say, you know, can I come to your home place? Can I core these trees or take mud from your lake? And you know what, I don't know how to get around that. I'm just going to lay that out to say that I don't think we necessarily deserve that trust, but we would love to have that as scientists. I think a lot of people on this call are probably curious about that.
I think building that trust is probably the hardest part of the entire thing. I want to go back to something I was thinking about though, and when Damon and Marcy and Dan were talking, for me, like, this is about two-way knowledge exchange, and I think that's what I appreciate the most of this is not necessarily what I learned about fire history, but what I learned about the places that I'm at, and it's not always easy either. Like, I've made, like, culturally, I've made mistakes in the past, and I'm thankful that like Marcy and Damon and Dan will either correct me, I guess. And I'm thinking of specific instances where even how you address people, which are things that I would think of being as pretty small, but like they're pretty major. Or thinking about, I used to think of trees as dead or stumps as dead. Most of what I sample are stumps. They're remnant pieces of wood on the ground. And I always say, yeah, we're going to focus on the dead trees. And I think it was a conversation with Marcy where we talked about, like, actually, they're still telling stories. So are they really dead? And it's made me think very, very differently about how we interact with the things that we collect, because they do have stories to tell. And so I struggle a lot, because especially like in writing, like how do you explain, like how do you write that? Like how do you put that in a report that like, well, we sampled remnant stumps. Do I have to say any remnant stumps have stories? So there's that part of it. That two-way knowledge exchange is really, really important. But the way that this normally works is that we as Western trained scientists have an idea. We write out our idea, we ask for research support, and then we go and we get sampling permission from whoever controls that landscape, whether it's the Park Service or the Forest Service or the state or whoever. We kind of circumvent, a long history of stewardship in that process. And that's how traditionally we've done it, right? And I think that may not necessarily be the way to do it. And so I think in 2013 or 14, when I started working in Voyagers, the first thing that we did, and it still started that same way, Voyagers wanted to do a fire history. And so they connected with me, I wrote a proposal, but then we went to a tribal council meeting before we did any of the sampling, just to ask permission. And this kind of goes back to kind of connects them all too. And in that community, at that point in time, they were sort of like, yeah, that seems fine. There were no real questions, no pushback, no anything, because there was a different level of interest in fire in that particular community. And I think that's something that I really took away from all of our collaborations, is that we can't be thinking about cultural groups as monolithic communities. We can't think of the Ojibwe as being monolithic. Every little community has its own sort of viewpoint with respect to fire and just landscape in general. So we tend to generalize, and I think that's part of what Western scientists try to do. They want to try to generalize pattern, but it's every single place I've been to has a different viewpoint with respect to fire or anything. And there's different language. We've talked about that in our Leech Lake group, that like sometimes a word that means one thing in Red Lake might mean something completely different in Leech Lake. And that's important. So I feel like this two-way knowledge exchange, I feel like I'm learning more from these projects than I, well beyond fire. So thank you for that.
Just one thing to add there along this theme is that, I don't consider myself any kind of pro at this spanning stuff. I think in the case of our project, Damon was just massively instrumental, and I just wanted to kind of share a couple of things that made this approachable for me and that made me get over my sort of fool's rush in fears about doing the wrong thing, is that Damon was really real. And what I mean by that is, instead of making this sort of an austere thing, no, you got to try again, try harder. It was certainly helping us do better, but also showing some vulnerability as well. Like one couple of the things that really struck me was Damon saying, he's out there trying to, with cassettes and maybe different recording now, record the last of fluent speakers, capture the vocabulary as much as possible. But he said, we're down to one word for duck, and we had more. And so we are dealing in an imperfect, we're all struggling. And so it's not like, hey, we got our thing here, do you get to play? It's more like, as Damon said, we're cultural beings, we're all trying to do our thing. And for me, just sort of him being willing to share some vulnerability and talk about the realities just helped this be more of just a human conversation than just sort of a, all caps intercultural exchange, right? Just being human, try to be decent, use your emotional intelligence. And for those of us sort of Western sciencey types, when people are kind to you and welcoming to you and tolerant of you, and when they go as far as sharing some of their own vulnerabilities, value and honor that and try to follow suit.
Curious, Gregor, did you express any vulnerabilities in those conversations?
Yeah, I'm not sure they were very sophisticated. It was just like, all right, Damon, we want to get this map right. And maps tell a lot. It's a picture, thousands of words in there. Maps are how you can put people on the map or erase them from the map. And we had a real iterative engagement with Melanie and Damon, and just trying to think about how to communicate this right. And, I alluded to it earlier, like there's a wide open landscape. There was a lot of opportunity for choice, for making mistakes, for choosing to work harder, to iterate one or two more times, to just really put an effort in and, emphasize things that matter. I think I'm just blabbering at this point. Maybe Damon wants to pick up, but I think it was about slowing down and focusing.
I think one more thing that I can add to this, and this is something that when Kurt mentioned that we had no history in the past 100 years of fire, one of the things we brought up in the discussions at Apostle Islands National Lakeshore is imagine the first encounters with Europeans and Anishinaabe people, and if at that point they would have said, hey, how do you all manage this space? How do you all do this? How do you if we're talking about being respectful today, and we're talking about doing things like in a collaborative way today. What if that would have happened in the 1600s? We'd be in such a different place right now with our understanding of fire and our understanding of these relationships. But now we're trying to catch back up to that understanding, which is really interesting, because if those first interactions were equitable and fair and respectful, then we literally wouldn't even be having this conversation right now, right? We would have known that. We would have been collaborating from the beginning, but we haven't. So here's where we are. So I just want to put that out there, because we think that the lack of knowledge today is because of like a misstep or something. It's like, no, this happened either deliberately or through just kind of the mix of cultures combining, but it was there and it was present at one time, an entire understanding of this. And so it would have been great if things would have been good from the beginning, and we would have been collaborating from the beginning and had friendship from the beginning, but that didn't happen. So here's where we are. Another thing that, and Evan can talk to this, one of our elders in Fond du Lac talks about our Chimokaman relatives as being our little brothers. And we know that our little brothers in our families usually are the ones that are a little bit more rascally or whatever we want to say, but sometimes we have to temper them. And this speaks to our creation story. We know that European Chimokaman people existed prior to contact. We know that we were all together at one time. That's in our creation stories. And so for then you all to come back to us, that wasn't, we knew that was going to happen. We knew that was a possibility coming through our culture. So when you come to us and then we see it as kind of like a little brother, where it's like, oh, we got to tell them this again, or we got to show them this again, or we got to help them with this again because they don't understand it or something like that. It's like, we care about you, we love you, but you gotta start thinking differently about how you're behaving in this space. So and Evan can speak to that if he wants to tell the story about little brothers.
I would love to, and I'm gonna avoid it because I think what you all are talking about right now, I think this is one of our other collaborators, Gloria Erickson, sent out an email a while ago. It's an essay by Sasha Michelle White. And it talked about Loads and Ladders is the name of it, Fire Humanities for Fire Adaptation. And in that essay, Sasha introduced the concept of cultural fuel loading, right? That like so you look at the forest and it's changed so much. And with our time left, we also want to save time. Like, how do you then actually get the fire back on the ground in a good way, a partnership? We talk about prescribed versus cultural fire. We don't have enough time. But I would love for you all to kind of share your thoughts on this idea that what you're talking about is essentially like within the Western colonial culture, settler colonial culture, like we have cultural fuel loading. We've got 100 years of built up fear and anger and terror of fire. And you have expressed that is not the same perspective. And so how does this conversation, that started around these paleo proxies, like how how do you address the cultural fuel loading that we're dealing with? Dan and Marcy, or I mean, really anybody, but I'd love to hear some thoughts. Beth goes first, maybe.
Well, I've just been struck by my students who are very interested in getting involved with prescribed fire on campus. We're using fire in prairies and to even in some of the oak woodlands. And I think it's really cool that students are learning about fire and getting experience with it. I think that this generation is going to have of ecologists and just people is going to have a different perspective than my generation did when we didn't do things like that. So maybe not what you were looking for, but an observation that I think is relevant.
Can I just speak to something that Damon brought up about related to little brother? I think that understanding the history of fire suppression in the United States is a really, really big thing, because there was a period of time in the early 1900s where there were voices, Western science voices out there that were saying, hey, look, you know, this worked. Indigenous peoples burned, we know it worked. But there was another group that was very influential politically that pushed it the other way. And a lot of it has to do with a very few key moments in Western US history, for the most part, where, you know, policy decisions were made. And those decisions went one way, and a large part of that was both related to racism, and a large part of that was related to commodification of the timber resource, very much so. And that started, I think, mostly in the Upper Great Lakes, but it did migrate out west. And I think understanding that history of fire suppression is a really, really important one. I like the term cultural fuel buildup because I think that's exactly what's happening. But it's that led, because of the timing, that led to a reduction of Indigenous knowledge because elders got older, and some of that cultural understanding of fire became hazier. It didn't go away, but it became hazier. And so I have always thought, like, my jumping in on these projects has always been about trying to reconnect cultural understanding through this gap in knowledge and through the border school movement. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I think understanding the history and the politics and just the structural racism that was involved, I think is important.
Well, tying into that too, that part of that process was the whole commoditization of trees, property, things like that, and protecting the trees because they had financial value, not because they had cultural value. And likewise, protecting people's property, you know, so we don't want their house to burn down and all that sort of thing. So, and it fits in exactly what you're talking about, Kurt, you know, the structural racism, this capitalistic mindset that was different than other mindsets that was coming in with the colonizers. And I think that's very important to do. And what we need to do to reduce that fuel load is help people understand that these fires can, you know, they can make things better in a broader sense, culturally, environmentally, ecologically. And it's not so much how many board feet can you get out of a red pine. You know, that's, I think, what we really need to struggle with.
So to build on this, and I think this goes at some of the questions that were offered up, because we had an experience of meeting with community up in northern Minnesota. We shared the data. We're like, this is what we think. And the response was like, we're glad you're here, but we're just kind of pissed off because it sounds like you broke it. Now you're asking us to help fix it. And we're like, well, that sums it up pretty closely. And so, you know, Damon, you've talked about this a lot. I've had these conversations with a lot of you on this call, but, you know, so this history is really important. But the beauty about all this history is that that's what you use to then figure out where you step next. Where do you go next? And, you know, it's 11:09 already. So technically we have 21 minutes on this call, but I would love to talk about, so from these conversations, from these relationships that have emerged with each other, fire, forest, with the land, you know, and all this potential for healing. What does it look like next? Right? What does it look like working with each other and with fire moving forward? And you could talk specifically like Stockton Island, what it actually looked like. Or, you know, there's a lot of places on the Chippewa National Forest where there's fire that's there more than it has been for quite a while. But also like 20 years, 50 years from now, like where are we going with this?
So I have one thing that we're doing right now is working with land management agencies within the ceded territory. So in the 1800s, Anishinaabe chiefs sold areas of land in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to the federal government. And in those treaties and those contracts to sell that land, we retain certain rights of occupancy within that land. So what our chiefs were looking at is us today, right? They're looking at the future of Anishinaabe people, and they wanted to make sure that everything we could do back then is what we can do right now. And so what we're doing at Fond du Lac and across the Great Lakes area is identifying areas within the ceded territory that have this legacy lock of red pines and blueberry and fire adapted species, to go and then collaborate with these land management agencies to get cultural fire back on the ground there, so that we can reestablish that relationship, reestablish that working relationship between humans and the landscape, and what we can get from that. And so we're collaborating with district rangers who are willing to recognize that we have the rights, and we want to be clear about how we're wording this, is that they're not allowing us to do anything. They're recognizing that we have the right to go in and do these things. So what we're saying is that if these land management agencies are not able to maintain the cultural fire regime that our ancestors established over thousands of years, then it may be our responsibility to just go in and do that then. And we love to collaborate with them. That'd be great, because that's really good for them and their PR and their mission. It looks good for them to collaborate with tribes, but using our rights that our ancestors established, we do not need their collaboration to do it. Is our statement, is that our ancestral homeland, our ceded territory, the places where our ancestors established relationship for thousands of years, we have that same right, inherent right, to go into those areas and remanage them or get them back on track to what our ancestors had done. So we love to collaborate and we want to do that, but at the same time, our elders are passing away, and those opportunities for our cultural transmission to happen in these areas where these ecosystems are established, we're losing that every day. And so that's why I talk about, like, let's stop talking, let's get moving, let's get working on this stuff and get those ecosystems back to where they used to be, so that our culture can maintain, we can still the stories, the language, the ceremony that's related to these places, that is the manifestation of that relationship in these places, that we can still do that. So that's, I don't even know what you asked, Evan, but that's all I had to say.
Well, I feel like in the upper Great Lakes, that's what's kind of starting, right? Like Stockton Island, Sunken Lake, places over on the Chip. And so Sean and Marcy and Dan can probably speak to this pretty clear. Cloquet Forestry Center, we are starting to see these collaborative relationships build. And I think that once you start, in Stockton Island, Damon, how big was Stockton Island's burn? Like 50 acres? 5? Yeah, it was tiny, right? It was like really tiny, but it was a start. And it was a start on national park landscape, which had never been done before in that area. So that little start was big. Cloquet Forestry Center, that little start was big. So these initial baby steps have shown that it works. And, Leech Lake, the Chippewa National Forest, they've been doing it. There's landscapes we work in that they've been doing this too. So, I don't know how that collaboration works out, because I'm kind of apart from that, because I'm not a firefighter or anything, but I know those things are going on. So, and Dan and Sean and Marcy can probably speak to that a lot better than I can.
Dan, your work there at Sunken Lake, ties into your master's thesis as a collaboration between Forest Service Research, Leech Lake Tribal College, and other partners, including the Chippewa National Forest. Lake 13, where we've done some work, that has been an area where Leech Lake's fire program, the Chippewa National Forest Fire Program, DNR are all trying different things, in that landscape to kind of get back to, some of the pre-National Forest landscapes there. And we just initiated a large EA, environmental assessment, that's going to be looking at fire dependent landscapes, that's going to be funded through a TFPA, Tribal Forest Protection Act grant. We've got a smaller one of those too for 48 acres that the Leech Lake is taking the lead on within the National Forest. So there are different mechanisms in which this is going on, but it's all because of these collaborations that have been happening across the board.
If I could add one thing quick about those 5 acres and what this really means to me is that from now on, those 5 acres are ours again. We are managing that space. We are taking care of that space. We are the primary disturbance factor again in that space. If it says it can still say on paper that it's National Park Service land, but we're the ones there managing it, and we're the ones on the ground taking care of it. So in my way of thinking, that is land back. And so every acre that we burn, every acre that we manage back in our ceded territory, for me, that is effectively land back, because we're the ones that are taking care of it again. And you can say whatever you want about which district owns it, or which, forest owns it, or what park owns it, or whatever you want to say. But if we're back in there burning, then it's ours again. So I'll just say that. 1 acre at a time.
Need a t-shirt that says that. Hey, Damon, maybe you can shed some light on this. Was the 5 acre burn on Stockton, when you wrote the fire plan and you went to get permission to burn that, did you have to use because I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure, but did you have to use fuel reduction as a justification for it? Or could you simply say, we want to do this fire for cultural purposes?
Yeah, and that was what was distinctive about the burn at Apostle Islands, is that our primary goal of that burn was to reintroduce that cultural relationship to that landscape. So all the other stuff like, berry production, fuel reduction, all the, the typical rationale for burning was secondary to just establishing that cultural relationship again. So our primary reason was humans on that landscape connecting through fire.
Damon, I'm curious. I saw the place right after the burn, but I haven't been back since. Have you been able to burn again?
That piece they haven't burned. We did do another 19 acre unit north of the original unit. So and we prepped some acreage this summer for another burn. And that's what's cool about it too, is once you start, then you got to keep going, and you got to go back in 4 years, you got to go back in 3 years, whatever the interval is. And that's what I love about just getting fire on the ground, is it means that we're starting. It means that we're getting back to that.
Marcy, what you got on your mind?
So I forgot to tell y'all that I'm an archaeologist here on the Chippewa National Forest. And I remember when I first started going into archaeology, I would tell my grandma, I'm really interested in this. And she would say, those were put there for a reason. If I would go and excavate a site, or maybe I was shovel testing, she said, those were put there for a reason. And as the project went on further and further, I just kept that in my head, things are put there for a reason. That's what was in my head constantly from my grandma. And then one day, Sean, he just out of nowhere, he's like, it's above ground archaeology, Marcy. We're not disturbing the ground. And that just kind of really pulled me in further. Okay, I get it. These trees are telling the story. My grandma said they're put here for a reason, and it's above ground. I'm all in.
And they keep telling you a story.
And they keep telling the story. Another note on that is my grandma, we're harvesters up here. We gathered quite a bit. And we'd say, Grandma, how do you do this? Grandma, how do you do that? She'd say, don't pay attention to that. As long as that root's staying in that ground, it's still going to give what it needs to give to the land.
So we're like 10 minutes out. I've got a couple more questions and thoughts that I'd be curious to let you run with, but you know, we've ranged around a little bit. There's no way that we can fit all the conversation in on this, but I'm curious, does anybody on the panel have something that you want to bring up because we haven't touched on it, but you think it's an important part of this conversation? Otherwise, I can ask you more questions.
I've got a couple of minor points just to share. And kind of responding to some questions in the chat. So one is just a general observation. There's a ton of good questions in the chat. Neil Gifford just asked a question I've seen asked several times. What do you do with burning in a place where the indigenous people are no longer there, et cetera? So that could be a whole topic. So I sort of want to suggest to you guys, just look at this chat, and there may be a whole nother webinar that you could do, maybe all indigenous people answering a lot of specific questions there. I also just thought I'd quickly answer a climate change question in there very quickly, which was, you know, I won't quibble with the language. There were some comments about it. Basically, what does climate change do to all of this? And I'd invite others to jump in because I'm not sure I'm going to get this perfect or complete, but I sort of feel like climate change is pulling the rug out from under us, right? And the question is, how sort of firmly planted on our feet are we to navigate this challenge, right? This non-stationarity. And I would submit that if we don't have a good understanding of the history of our systems, we are in a much worse position as far as stewarding whatever, conserving whatever it is we want to conserve. And just a minor illustration in that Stockton Tombolo, among all kinds of other conservation ideas, that's a recreational area. And just having an understanding that this is a system that maybe has had some cultural fuel loading over a century, that fire is an okay thing to use there, and that in this case, that might be what keeps people safe in that landscape, just sort of a tangential illustration. But the point is, these tools and working them together, I think is essential in navigating a new future. It doesn't mean everything we used in the past, the way we did it, is how we can proceed, but that kind of gives us an informational basis to be creative together and chart a path forward.
One of the things I think about and have thought about a lot myself is, you know, so we're talking a lot about human perspectives here. And a lot of times, you know, when you're working a stand of 300-year-old, 400-year-old red pine, and that's where most of my own work has happened. And I think a lot of the work here is centered around red pine because it's just such a fire system, you know. And, you know, recognizing that the very much, Marcy, to your point, like those scars on those trees, those are stories that those trees are carrying. They're also stories of the people, and that those have persisted through all this time and all this change, and how those same trees are experiencing this. And to be a red pine casting seed for 100 years and not seeing a single baby, you know, how's that? And so with the idea of climate change, and as it's, you know, we got an idea, but it's so much uncertainty. How does that fit into this? I mean, essentially, are you not arguing for like taking these relationships that you all are building to guide the way forward, and in that trying to keep as much as we can, because when it all shakes out, the more diversity we've got, the more likely that something beautiful and functional is going to emerge on the other side. Thoughts?
Can I make a really quick point, Evan? Because you brought something up that I think is worth pointing out. You said you're working in, a lot of us work in 300 to 400-year-old red pine stands. A lot of us don't, right? Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of 300 to 400-year-old red pine stands left. A lot of the work that we do actually doesn't occur in pine stands at all. It occurs in whatever came up after the pine stands got harvested or taken away. And I think that actually kind of goes towards both the intersection between climate change and fire suppression. Because what's coming in isn't necessarily pine because we haven't had fire, but as climate changes, we're starting to see shifts in vegetation too. So I do think that that's something that's really, really important. We've seen wholesale changes in forest composition that in the last 100 years that I think are important to acknowledge. And we're going to see another, especially if we're not tending to the challenges, we're going to see another wholesale change in vegetation composition due to humanity's sort of interactions with the environment. So that's a little bit of an aside, but
Well, I think that's, I mean, that's one of our main tenets of our culture is to always be looking forward. What's up ahead? What's coming? What can we prepare for now for what's coming in the next season, in 10 years, 20 years, future generations, all that stuff. And Gregor can speak more to the conditions that we'll be facing in the next 20 to 30 years due to climate change. But so I've been doing fire since 1995. I've been chasing fire across this country. Last year we were in Oklahoma chasing fire and saw some of the most intense fire behavior I've ever seen in my life. We were having oak trees, which normally don't. Normally you can hang up a fire in the hardwoods, but we were having oak trees torch out, canopy, full crown runs at night even during this heat. We were working fires in 115 degrees. Like, that's what the new normal is going to be. And if you think about the vegetation capability of the Midwest region right now, how much fuel is there? Like every single square centimeter is like full of some kind of plant, right? And imagine 115-degree weather now in Minnesota and how our fire staff are going to have to deal with that kind of stuff. I mean, this is coming, and it's scary for a lot of the fire people I know, because we're going to get our asses kicked when it happens. And so building resiliency through the established relationships that have been happening on this continent for thousands of years through managing fire is going to help us in 20 years when it hits us. So building resiliency with species diversity, building resiliency with fuel loading, all that stuff. Like, again, we got to be thinking ahead, 15 years, 100 years, whatever it's going to be, and set ourselves up for that right now.
Wow. I think at that moment, I'm going to look at the clock and say, Andrea asked for a couple minutes. And I will just say this was awesome and it was so much fun. And I would love to keep going. I know so many of you have so much more voice that you didn't get a chance to share. And so I look forward to those collaborations. I wish everybody the best to build your own networks and collaborations. I heard authenticity, vulnerability, honesty, and willingness to do really hard emotional work as keys to being a good partner and figuring out your way forward. So thank you everybody for being here. 290 stuck it out the full hour and a half. That's amazing.
we should do a podcast to answer all their questions, though. We should,
That's
like,
a great idea, Kurt.
maybe separately we can all get together and just go through the questions and answer them.
Yeah,
All right.
seriously, like this conversation, that's the thing, is we all end the conversation and then we all go our separate ways. It's like, let's keep all these 293 people together so we can get movement happening.
I love that
Alright,
idea. And
Could
that
you
is,
imagine the
that is-
forest we would make if we all came together and worked together?
absolutely.
I
And
echo
that's what we're trying to do with feeling collaboration. That is the heart of this. So I did see in the chat different people sharing their email addresses, some conversations going on potential opportunities for everyone, participants. All of our panelists did include their email addresses in that chat. Reach out. Let's continue this conversation. And Kurt, I do love the idea. I'm going to save this chat. We'll pull out some of those questions, and it'd be great if we could address some of those and email that out to participants. So just a couple of items. I wanted to say thank you again so much to all of the participants for joining for this discussion. Evan, thank you so much for moderating. And to all of our panelists, I want to keep this going. Could we talk for like another couple hours? I'm not ready to end it, but we are at time. I do want to invite everyone next month, join us for our next discussion in this Feeling Collaboration series, where we'll be talking about the future is smoky, and we have a great lineup of panelists. It'll be moderated. The discussion will be moderated by Eric Evanson with the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. And there's I just threw a link to the chat where you can see more about our panelists that we have. So that's December. Again, please come back. And lastly, as we close out this meeting, everyone should automatically receive an evaluation. Please fill out that evaluation. Let us know what you think about this series. It does help us. We do review those evaluations thoroughly, and it helps to inform how we continue planning. So at that, just want to say thank you again and really appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Good.
Good to see everybody.
This was fun.